Hi there. Let's see, I think, Mark, I'm shorter than you. There you go, I think that'll work. Okay, good morning. It is great to see you all here. Thanks so much, Mark, for that introduction. So I'm Dr. Bo Ruberg. I go by Bo. I use they, them pronouns. And my talk today is diversity in esports, video game culture, collegiate play, and live streaming. So it's really exciting to know that there are a lot of educators here in the audience, folks who, if I understand Mark right, are working on building programs at the university level, but also the high school level. I'm an academic. So I'm going to try and kind of bring these things around so that they're useful to folks in the audience who are building programs like that. But feel free, I'll leave some room for Q&A at the end, and we can come back around to those topics. So if you're thinking things like, okay, great, but how do I apply that to what I'm trying to do? Let's definitely think about that, and we'll come back around to it. I also, like Mark, want to give a big thank you to all the grad students here at UCI who have made this event possible. We have some here. I know there are others running around. I organize events myself, and this is not easy, especially for grad students, so I think they've done a really amazing job. We're going to have that little escape thing at the top. Okay, so this is just my Twitter. You're very welcome to tweet from this talk if you like. It's just a good thing to announce that people are welcome to do that. And also, you're welcome to take photos if you want to. Always a good thing to say as well. There are going to be a few slides later on that are designed for you to be able to take photos because they have links to resources you might want to check out after the talk. So keep an eye out for those as well. So just a little bit more about me so that you kind of know what perspective I'm bringing here. As Mark said, I'm an assistant professor here in informatics. I work on gender and sexuality in digital media. My focus tends to be LGBT issues in video games. And I think of myself as coming from kind of a fruit salad background, by which I mean I'm kind of a medley of different things. So I used to be a tech and games journalist. I have worked in humanities programs. I've worked in game design and development programs. And now I'm here in a School of Information and Computer Science. So I'm bringing together all those different perspectives and often in a way to translate for industry. So at places like the Game Developers Conference. So you'll hear a little bit of all of those things. On top of all that, as I mentioned, I'm also a community organizer and event organizer. So I've been running this event, helping run this event with lots of collaborators for the last 6 years. It's called the Queerness in Games Conference. It is 300 people in a building for the weekend being super queer. So it's a combination of academics, but also activists, game makers. It's a way to bridge conversations across academia and game design and game development. So this is just a shout out. It happens to be that our next event is in May in Montreal, but the deadline, if you make games or you want to give a talk about queerness in games, is in just a few days. So we've got a CFP up on qgcon.com, and that's a way if you are feeling passionate about diversity issues and you want a space that's really dedicated to thinking those things through, that's a great space for it. Also a quick plug for my book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer. I love the cover. It's very rainbow. Okay, so I'm here talking today about diversity in esports, and I think the connection that I have to diversity might already be pretty obvious in what I'm saying. I'm a queer person, I study queer games, I work with queer players, but this esports side of the equation is a little bit less obvious. So there are tons of great esports scholars out there today, and this is, I think, a kind of misconception, I'm going to talk about it more later, that esports scholarship is new. Esports scholarship isn't actually new. It's been around since about 2006, so there are lots of folks who are real experts in this area, and I am not one of them. So I'm here today almost like an ambassador. I know a whole lot about games. I know a whole lot about games culture and live streaming, things that are adjacent to esports itself. But one of my roles is to be a kind of translator for some of that work that's out there already on esports. And a lot of it comes from women and from people of color. So it's just particularly important not to kind of lose that as we think about esports in the university. So with that said, there are a bunch of things I do that are related to esports. So one of them is being involved here with esports at UCI and the Esports Arena here. So I serve on the faculty oversight committee for the Esports Arena. So if there are faculty here in the audience who are kind of working in conjunction with esports on their own campuses, and you're curious about like what's the faculty perspective, that's something that I can speak to. We had a diversity in esports committee a few years back that I was part of, and I've also been working on creating documentation that explains esports to other people on campus who might not be as familiar with it. So for example, administrators who are feeling a little nervous about diversity in esports, let's say feeling nervous about gender in esports, and they need someone to translate, but they don't actually know that much about video games, which is okay, right? We all know about different things. But so I've been working on that, which is a particularly interesting challenge. And then the other piece is the research that I do on live streaming. So I run what we call the Inclusive Streaming Initiative. It's a research group that's been going on for about the last 2 years here at UCI. My collaborators, let's see if any of you are in the room at the moment, are Amanda Cullen, Kat Brewster, and Spencer Ruelos. And we just had a big 2-day workshop last month with some of the top live streaming scholars from across the globe. So it's actually a really exciting time to be working here at UCI on streaming. And our focus there is specifically on diversity. So often we're looking at experiences of gender and sexuality in live streaming. And as you probably know, live streaming and esports are not one and the same, but they're very closely related, right? A lot of top streamers are esports players. A lot of the kind of ecosystem of esports, the way it gets shared with the world, is through streaming. So those connections are really important. Okay, so that's me. But what about this thing that we're here to talk about, right, which is diversity and esports? This is a good topic, I think. This is the topic I picked, so I like this topic. But it's a really big topic. So let's try and break it down. So first of all, what do we mean by diversity? When I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about people's diverse identities, their experiences, their backgrounds. So I'm thinking about things like race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality and disability and socioeconomic class, all of these factors that are often intersecting issues of privilege and marginalization. Diversity isn't a perfect term. There are lots of very valid critiques of it. Sometimes it becomes a kind of corporate or an institutional buzzword, but we're going to use it here today because it's a helpful starting point. So I know some folks in the room, and I know that you already care about identity and privilege and power, and that's awesome. But I also know that for some of you folks, if you play kind of different roles around esports, this might not be something that you spend a lot of time thinking about. So I was asking myself as I was preparing this talk, what's the best way to approach it, right? And I think rather than give you a kind of really academic-y, theory-heavy breakdown, I think what's useful for us as a group is to offer kind of like a crash course in esports and diversity. Sort of run through of the big points that should be on our minds so that we have a shared set of questions and a shared vocabulary that we as a community here at this conference can keep coming back to over the course of the next few days. Because one of the things that I want to sell you on over the course of this talk is this idea that diversity and inclusion matter to everybody. Right? And by that I mean everybody in the world, regardless of your identity, but I more specifically mean everybody here in this room. So there's no role that you can play in relation to esports, high school esports, collegiate esports, really any component of esports, esports research. There's no role that you can play where diversity and inclusion don't matter. So you might be sitting there thinking like, yeah, but the identity stuff isn't really what I do personally. And the thing I would say to that is, if you feel like this isn't what you do, then this is especially important for you. Because this is what's happening all around you, right? These are the factors that go into the work that you do. So the hope is that by talking these things through, by talking them through right off the bat at the start of the conference, there will be this magical moment sometime over the next day and a half where you'll be sitting in a session and you'll hear something and you'll find this voice coming up from your chest and you'll raise your hand and you'll say something like, yes, but how does privilege affect this situation? Or who's being excluded from this? And then you'll think, oh my God, am I that person who's always asking about diversity? And the answer will be yes. And that will be good. So that's my purpose here, is to get you thinking in that way. And so now that we know that we are in a course, We're going to think about this in terms of some key topics. So I'm going to try and break this down into sort of 10 little mini lessons. We're going to go through them fast because we started a little late, but here are kind of the general areas. So we're going to think about games culture, and esports research. So that's kind of the background, like what lays the backdrop to this. We're going to think about diversity issues in esports more broadly. We'll look at challenges for collegiate esports, and when I say collegiate, I think also here a lot of this is going to be applicable at the high school level. We're going to talk about live streaming as something adjacent to esports, and that's also the area where my own research lies. And then I'm going to leave you with some takeaways, so things that you can bring back with you. And since we now have a course, we're going to call it Esports and Diversity 101, 10 lessons in like 30 minutes, probably less at this point, so you can emerge knowledgeable about inclusion and identity and why they matter, and then go off and feel anger and enthusiasm in all the right measures, and maybe even have some ideas about what to do about it. Sound good? Cool, let's do it. Okay, so let's start here. Let's start with games culture and esports research. This is kind of the background. Okay, so lesson number 1, video game culture shapes esports, and it can be the worst. So when we talk about diversity in esports, there is a kind of history and a set of challenges we're up against that aren't just about esports. So video game culture can be amazing. Video games can be amazing. I'm someone who loves video games and has been working professionally in games for about 15 years now. But there are also a lot of things that are hard with games culture. It can be very exclusionary to women, to people of color, to queer people. It often has this idea of what is called a toxic meritocracy. Christopher Paul, I think, is around this weekend and wrote a book on that. So this idea that to be successful at games, you're the best, right? You are the person who's just most talented, as if that doesn't have anything to do with identity and with politics. And that's not true, because different kinds of people have different access to games when they're younger, have different social situations where they're encouraged or discouraged from playing. And there's a lot of harassment that happens in games culture. So harassment is something that I've experienced extensively myself for the last 15 years. And also it happens to my colleagues. So this is a challenge, right? This is the backdrop against which you are building up esports. Kishona Gray, I'm gonna give you some shout outs to, I see someone like hyping Kishona, yeah. Give you some shout outs to some folks who are doing really great work in this area, so you can check them out if you want. Kishona Gray, I think, summarized this really nice in her work on women of color on Xbox Live. She says, video game culture fosters a context of dominance, privileging whiteness and masculinity. This often creates a negative environment for women and people of color within the larger gaming community. So here's that reference. This is her article that comes from. Here is Christopher Paul's book on the toxic meritocracy of video games. So again, I would just stress, that doesn't mean that video games are bad. That doesn't mean that games culture is bad. Games bring people together. They let them express themselves. They're an artistic medium. But it's worth thinking when you're building up an esports program that you're up against a long history of discrimination within the culture that surrounds games. Okay, lesson number 2. Esports research is not new, and that matters for diversity. So I was mentioning that actually there's been work in this area for a long time, since about 2006. And I don't just tell you that because I'm a professor and I'm trying to teach you things, but also because it matters. And the reason that it matters is that a lot of the people who were doing that earlier research, like I said, are women, people of color, people who can be erased if we just think about esports research as being new. So it's true that there are some new areas, right? I think I spent some time with just kind of looking at the history of esports research over the last 13 years to try and identify trends. And I would say that the trends right now, we're seeing an emphasis on education, we're seeing an emphasis on business, on gambling, on IP, and those things are all important to talk about. But if you look at the earlier history of esports research, it's on things like community and culture, and diversity, and gender, and race, and masculinity, right? Things we need to still be talking about. So this is just a call, especially for the students in the audience, the other academics in the audience, that when you do esports research, please, please, please look back at that history. And here are 2 super useful bibliographies for that. So sometimes you'll submit an article as an academic to peer review, and peer review if anyone hasn't gone through it, is a kind of nerve-wracking process where you send it off and strangers tell you what's wrong with your work. And people will say things like, you need more citations. And you'll say, well, that's nice, but what? So these two bibliographies are really helpful because they are, and Will's here somewhere too, right? Hey. Thank you. These two bibliographies are really helpful from T.L. Taylor and Will Parton because they give you a really thorough starting point. So you can see across the history of esports research up until the stuff that is really, really current. Okay, let's jump into this piece, which is diversity issues in esports in particular. So here are some things that we need to be talking about. And I don't have like a neatly packaged answer for you about how to fix these things, right? We're not at the stage where we can just kind of wave a wand and fix everything, but we're at the stage where we need to be talking about these things. And I think that's in some ways the biggest point, is that diversity, identity, access should be part of all of our conversations. So one of the things we really need to be talking about is gender in esports. And when I say gender, I don't actually just mean women, right? Cisgender women. And cisgender means people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Because often when we talk about gender and diversity in general, we think, okay, we need women in esports, and we do. But that's not the whole picture, right? There are also non-binary people, there are also transgender people, people who should be included as well. So some things to think about when we think about gender in esports. Women players, right, face a lot of challenges. They face barriers to entry, but they also face harassment once they're visible, right? So this is something for us to think about, is not just how to get women into esports, not just how to get them onto teams, but also how to support them if they get sexist remarks or they get harassed online, right? That's actually a big part of the experience. We also are finding that women are kind of in a possible situation when it comes to feminism. So Amanda Cullen, who's one of my advisees, hey, and you've got such great people in the audience here. Amanda Cullen, who's one of my advisees and also my collaborator, has been doing some really great work on just the kind of impossible bind that women esports players are in when it comes to feminism, right? Because if they want to express their views about women's rights, then they get harassed. Or maybe they don't want to have to be the picture of feminism representing all women in esports, but that's kind of the position they get put in. So if we want to promote women in esports, we have to think about kind of where we're putting them in that bind. There's a lot of sexist rhetoric that still moves around through esports. One of these terms that you hear a lot is girl gamers. So women who are playing at just the highest levels of skill are still referred to as girl gamers. Emma Witkowski does some really great work on this. And also we need to be thinking more not just about women and trans women, but also about masculinity. So what does it mean to be a man playing, doing esports, right? What does this vision of being a guy gamer look like? And one of the things that I want to bring up when I talk about these things is just the fact that this is the conversation that's happening around esports, right? So one of the reasons to think about it and to care about it, it's important for social justice, but also keep in mind that these are the kind of stories, these are the kind of news stories that are circulating around the programs that you might be working on or spinning up. And we're seeing it here too at UCI, where journalists are contacting us to ask this. Where are women? Why are there no women on a college team? Why are there no women in a certain event? So it's worth thinking about the answers to these things and what you want to do about it. So in addition to talking about gender, another important thing to talk about is race. So most of the conversations right now are around why are there no women in the following area of esports, or why are there only a few, right? Because I certainly don't mean to say there are no women esports players, they just are less prominent, less visible. But we don't talk as much about why don't we see as many Black esports players, as many Latinx esports players, right? Black and brown people who are visible in esports. And that also relates to sexuality. So this is Sonic Fox, right? Also a shout out for Sonic Fox. Noted as the top esports player in the world in 2018 at the Game Awards. And Sonic Fox is very vocal about being Black, being gay, being a furry. Sonic Fox also identifies as non-binary, gender non-binary. And on the one hand, this was a really amazing moment when he accepted this award. For a lot of us in the queer gaming community, it was really awesome to see him stand up there because the speech that he gave, he said, I'm gay, I'm black, I'm a furry, and I'm the best esports player in the world, right? And that's a really amazing statement. And we saw it picked up by news outlets like Out that are LGBT news outlets. But there was also a ton of pushback, right? There was pushback and harassment directed at him both for being black and for being gay. So these are things we need to be thinking about too. And it's not to say that it's all bad, right? That someone like Sonic Fox can be such a role model, can be such a leader, is wonderful, but we also need to keep thinking about how race and sexuality are part of this equation. Okay, so let's transition then to think about challenges for collegiate esports, and let's kind of broaden that out to thinking about esports in an educational setting. So there are some really serious challenges to diversity and inclusion in educational esports, right, in collegiate or high school esports. And I think the most obvious one, like I was saying, is gender. So many college teams, especially those that are at the most competitive level, are made up almost entirely, or sometimes entirely, of men. Women can often act in support roles, so we see a lot that women act in support roles, so things like shoutcasters or community organizers or community managers, right? But that work can be undervalued. So even if they're working just as hard, they sometimes don't get the same recognition, right? But they can still face day-to-day discrimination. So I think it's worth dispelling some myths right off the bat. Like I was mentioning, there's this idea of meritocracy in games, the idea that you just have to be really good and you'll succeed. But that's not the whole picture, right? So let's just do away with the idea that women aren't as good at games as men, right? That they're just naturally not as good. That's not true. Right? There are reasons why women are not on esports teams, and some of them are beyond your control, right? Some of them are cultural. They have to do with things like who was encouraged to play games as kids, who was socialized that way, who had access to those materials. It's also the fact that games culture can be really toxic, right? So women can take a step back and not want to engage. I would also say that unless you're doing an exceptionally good job of diversity and inclusion efforts on your campus or in your school, you may well have women who are really good who aren't trying out, right? Because there's an idea that this is not going to be a welcoming space. So that's something to think about as you build up more efforts. Again, we need to be thinking about racial diversity, diversity of sexual identity, how to loop those folks in as well. But there are also diversity concerns that come up in ways that people aren't really talking about. So this is more at the university level, but I suspect it happens at high school level too. So this is a diversity concern for faculty specifically. So people like me, teachers, who aren't necessarily focused on esports or have other obligations often get looped into helping build esports programs. And on the one hand, we want to help, right? This is such an important area. It's growing so fast. We really want to help make them better. But this is not in our job description. And so you end up with people of color, with queer folks, with women kind of taking on the extra labor of helping build up esports programs that they weren't, that's not necessarily what they were there to do. So it's just something to think about as you reach out to people who might help support you. Who are you asking? Who's got the bandwidth? And how are you supporting them along the way? So again, this is just something to think about in terms of what kind of visibility you're getting for your programs. So again, stories like this are being written and kind of circulating widely. They're kind of spreading a certain narrative about college esports in terms of who's getting access to resources, who's not, why aren't we seeing diversity? So I want to convince you that diversity matters because it just matters, right? It matters for social justice. It matters for ourselves as people. But if you want to think about this way, it also matters for PR, right? It matters for how your program looks. And you want to be the person in this story, you want to be the program in this story where they say, yes, but have you seen college X or high school X? They have this amazing team. They have this amazing scholarship that is more diverse. So there are lots of reasons to get behind this. So let's talk about what you can do to promote diversity and inclusion in esports and educational settings. Also just note that there is good news, right? I'm not just trying to be a downer. There's good things you can do. So the first thing is that there are some really amazing resources through AnyKey, which is a local organization. Is Morgan here with us? Morgan will be here later, I think. NEKey explicitly creates resources and programs to support diversity and inclusion in games, and more specifically in esports. So they have some amazing resources on their websites, white papers about what the issues are, and just really specific guidelines for how to get more women, more diverse folks into your programs and how to make them comfortable. Here are some additional things I would point out. So one is to think about your code of conduct. Do you have a code of conduct? Right? Questions to ask yourself. And a code of conduct would be the document where you say, what are the community guidelines for the spaces where esports happens in my campus, on my campus, in my school, right? So if you have, we're lucky enough to have the Esports Arena, right? So we have a code of conduct for the physical space that is the Esports Arena, but it might be a club, right? It might be a room that you meet in. It might be for your Discord. What are the community guidelines that say what is acceptable behavior, what is discriminatory behavior, to make sure you have that and make sure it's really clear and concrete. And there's gonna be a talk at 10:30. There's a panel at 10:30 that will include an entire talk just on how to make your community guidelines more inclusive with Evan Conaway, Matt Knutson, and Amanda Cullen. So definitely check that out. I would also say look for opportunities to allow marginalized folks to play in an esports setting without needing to fend off bias. So here's what I mean by that. We can do lots of work to try and bring in marginalized folks to esports teams. But sometimes it's nice to have space where you just get to be yourself. There was an event that Mark and our UCI Esports Arena and our LGBT Center organized last spring, the trans event, that was just for transgender players to come and get to check out the arena. And they didn't have to be like, competitive esports players. The requirement was that they were transgender. And they held space for that, right? There was a sign on the door that said, this is just who this is for. And I know that sounds like it's exclusionary in another direction, but it's actually really helpful because what I saw was people walk into the arena who would have never walked into the arena, who would have never felt comfortable, not because of anything the arena's doing, but just because gaming culture has a certain reputation, right? And they sat down and they played. But here's the other thing I saw. It was a rainy day, which rarely happens. If you live here in Southern California, it was like a really rainy day, which is very strange for us. And so there weren't a ton of people there. So I think at a certain point, whoever was working the door decided, no, that's okay, let's just let other folks in too. And as soon as other people started coming in, a lot of them were trans high school kids, the trans kids just like froze. And you could tell that the environment was different instantly because you put up a wall, right? You're worried what's gonna happen around you. So I would say the more that you can create those spaces where you really hold space for marginalized folks just to try it out and be themselves is really great. There's also research from Nick Taylor that is useful here to think about what it might mean to emphasize participation over competition. So I know that sounds odd, right? Because esports is competitive play. But especially for folks who are building high school programs, you might just think about your values, right? At the end of the day, are you valuing building the team that gets the furthest? Or are you thinking about building a program where people participate? And what studies have found is that the more you value participation over competition, the more you have diverse players there in your programs. We talked about valuing the work of women in support roles. This is another shout out to TL Taylor's work. So TL is an expert in esports. She wrote an entire book called Raising the Stakes. She gave a keynote at DIGRA this summer. DIGRA is the Digital Games Research Association Conference. And she has just like a list of 20 super concrete things you can do if you run a collegiate program in an educational setting to help make your esports program better. So this is just a huge shout out to her work and also to that in particular. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our little micro lessons here. And now we're coming around to streaming. So this is where I was talking to you about the inclusive streaming initiative that we are working on here. This is just a photo of our team looking very sunny in SoCal, actually. I like that. So this is the core of us who are working on this project. And again, the idea behind this project is that we are interested in identity, diversity, harassment in live streaming. So this is actually a huge topic. There are also many people doing research on live streaming. But it's an important topic because this is a place where esports is really kind of meeting the world in a lot of ways, and a place where esports players are really expressing themselves, in addition to lots of other types of players. So I just want to walk you through kind of some of the core things that we've been finding in our research, so you can see what we've been up to. So we're at 7 now. So lesson number 7. Diverse streamers experience harassment, and dealing with it takes work. So this is something that's true in general for live streaming. It's something you might want to think about if you have students who are streaming or if you're encouraging students to start streaming. The reality on a platform like Twitch, which is still the primary streaming platform for games, is that people who don't fit the image of a kind of typical male gamer will experience harassment. That's the reality. So that might mean little sexist comments. That might mean it can take lots of different forms. People harassing you on other social media accounts. It's something that people deal with every day. And the thing that's important to realize that we've been studying is that dealing with that takes work. So one of the studies that we've done looks at what's called affective labor or emotional labor that goes into dealing with these things. So it's not just getting a moderator to pull out all the toxic comments in your chat. It's also the emotional work that it takes, right? So often for women streamers, what that means is that they have to cultivate a certain persona that won't get them harassed, right? Because harassment, and again, you can see this in lots of news stories, harassment is so pervasive that they know that it's coming to them, right? So women will talk about making a persona that is enough like a gamer that people won't question that they're a gamer, but is also friendly and approachable, that they should be friendly and build connections with their audience at all times. So we've been looking at the YouTube videos that women streamers post about the kind of work that goes into streaming and analyzing and coding those to see what are the kinds of emotional work that go into dealing with harassment. So that's just a lesson in the fact that not only is harassment pervasive, but it takes work for diverse streamers in ways that you might not expect. So the next thing is about the cultural discourse and the platform politics around streaming. So what do I mean by cultural discourse? I mean not just the things that happen to streamers or the things that streamers do, I mean the way that people talk about streaming. So we conducted another study where we looked at the Twitch subreddit, which can be a rough place if you've spent time on Twitch, or on Reddit, on subreddits. And we were looking for the way that people on that subreddit talk about women streamers and women streamers' bodies. So we were particularly interested in this term, titty streamer. Sounds like a silly term, but it's actually used a lot in similar terms to harass women streamers. And the idea is that they are putting their bodies too far forward. So they're showing too much cleavage, or they're dressing in a way that's seen as too sexy. And that's used to say these aren't legitimate streamers. These aren't real streamers. They're not real gamers. They're just in it for the money. They're just in it to show off their body. So we've been doing work on how that language, these terms that seem really like juvenile, like titty streamer, are actually a kind of sexist discourse that perpetuates some really negative ideas about women streamers. And then platform politics are part of this too. So here's what I mean. A platform like Twitch has policies, right? We were just talking about community guidelines. They have their own community guidelines. And often they address things like what kind of things you can wear on screen, or what kind of content you can show in games. And a lot of their guidelines have to do with gender and sexuality and gendered bodies. So often they will include language that can be really fuzzy around what you can wear, what you can screen, and they end up being used to discriminate mostly against women. So we've seen a number of stories recently where women streamers who are dressing in ways that are not particularly provocative or would be fine for men streamers are getting reported and getting banned. So some of the work we've been doing is doing an analysis of those community guidelines to think about how we could rewrite them to make them more inclusive. Yeah.
It's not, and the esports stream is nothing new, because in high schools and especially, think of dances and how our policies are women have to have shoulders covered or knees covered, or just their dress is always seemingly seen as too provocative, where the guys can wear whatever they pretty much want to a dance and are never kept out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, let's come back to that in the Q&A because that's a context that I didn't know about. That's good to hear. Yeah, and so then the last point I would make around streaming is just to tell you about the new direction that our work is taking. So there are good sides to gender and sexuality in streaming, and one of the things that we're really excited to look into is how LGBT streamers are using streaming as a way to engage in self-expression and community building. So one example of this is the Stream Queens. So this is a group of drag performers who have really been building a queer community around their drag performances on Twitch. So just to say that it's not just problems, but also supporting people who are doing amazing things. Okay, so let's just close out with some takeaways. This is in some ways the biggest thing that I would leave you with, is that diversity work is a process, and that's okay. So I know sometimes this stuff is kind of awkward to talk about, or it can feel like you're being chastised for not doing something right. Even the people who do this for a living, we get it wrong all the time, right? And it's a process. We learn, we try and do better, we keep showing up to deal with these issues. So here's what I would leave you with. One is to keep showing up. And here's what I mean by that. Keep coming back to diversity, right? If you slip up, if something happens, don't run away from it, right? Keep thinking it through, keep being self-critical, whether you're a scholar, you're building a program, it should be part of the conversation you keep coming back to. Don't pretend there isn't a problem, right? Just because there are issues within a program you're building, that doesn't mean you're bad or your program is bad, right? The thing that's most important is actually to address those issues. So I know it can be tempting, especially for public relations, to want to say, we're doing great. And you might be doing great. But the way to do great in a way that's really socially just is to keep addressing the things that aren't working. And then be an advocate, not just an ally. So I know that a lot of folks, especially around LGBT issues, want to be allies, and allies are great. But what we need are advocates. We need people who have privilege, who aren't marginalized, actually stepping up and saying, no, we're going to address this issue. We're not just leaving it to marginalized folks. We are here to take some of the work off their shoulders. We are here to actively make it better. So that's where I'm going to leave things. I think we still have a few moments for Q&A, and thanks very much. So I know Mark said it was okay to run over a few minutes because we started a little late. So I'm happy to take questions. Yeah?
Yeah, so back to that point, you know, when we're talking about especially as setting them up, I work in a high school realm, and I know one of the issues that we have is we do have a separate code of conduct that usually goes beyond what our student code of conduct is, but our student code of conduct is still the thing that we have as like our base that we have to follow. And I know you're talking about streaming companies and picking out women, you know, it seems like a streaming thing, but really even as an institutional level at schools, you know, you could see a male walk into a school wearing short shorts and nothing is said. Whereas my daughters walk into school and they're asked to straighten their arms out to make sure that their fingertips are not below the hemline of their skirts or their shorts or whatever. And so it's almost this institutionalized, I guess you could say, rule that is against women, because it seems like there's a lot of things that we do against women. For example, breastfeeding in public is something that is seen as inappropriate in some places. So it's endemic, I guess, of the larger culture that we have, not just specific to streaming.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So just for the stream in terms of the mic, to summarize what you were saying, I think you were saying that, you know, this isn't just something that's about streaming. When we see the way that these guidelines regulate women's bodies, it also comes up in the high school setting and community guidelines. It comes up in what's socially accepted, like breastfeeding in public, right? I think you're absolutely right. I think what we're seeing in a lot of these things in games culture, in esports and streaming, we're seeing larger social issues reflected. And I think we absolutely should address those larger social issues to the extent that we can, right? That's something that I feel very committed to. But one of the things that we can do a little bit more directly is something like interface with Twitch to try and show them how that discrimination is coming out. Or I don't know if you have the opportunity to interface with, you know, high school administration to talk about that. But I think you're absolutely right that it's connected to larger issues. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. So just to repeat it back a little bit, and then we have a mic to pass around. It sounds like the question is, Tail Taylor talks about, that's where you started, right? Talks about barriers to things like racial inclusion in collegiate sports, collegiate esports, also like stigma around like casual versus hardcore players, console versus PC. Yeah, and so what do you do to break those down? So I think one thing is those resources that I mentioned from Any Key and Teal Taylor's keynote are a great place to start because they've been really doing that on the ground. But some things that come to mind for me are things like thinking about what games count in your esports program, right? So there are things we think of as traditional esports like Smash that do actually have a stronger like racially diverse representation, fighting games in general. But there are also lots of games that we don't think of as traditional esports games that have competitive play, right? Like people, oh my God, like competitive play Animal Crossing, right? Which is amazing. So one possibility is to think about like not just going for the biggest names in terms of games in esports, but like what else could draw more people in and it be seen as valued in that space.
So one of the things that we've seen a lot in this industry is the prolific use of language and degradation to people as the streamers on Twitch. You know, these are kids. I understand they're young kids and they speak the way they do, but you know, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I don't let her watch Twitch because the words that are spoken by these players, the Fs and the vagina words and words that I would not want her to watch, want her to listen. I want her to be involved in this industry, but I won't let her watch Twitch because of the prolific language that is done. And I'm just wondering if anybody is reaching out to Twitch to try to, and the other platforms to try to see if there's something that can be done to kind of work with these people to tell them that some words are just not okay.
Yeah, so I think you're totally right that there's a lot of that on Twitch, and I've heard that from other parents too. So Samantha Blackman, who's a professor from Purdue, was here for our live streaming workshop last month. She's a streamer, and she also has a kid who's roughly the same age as your kid. And she was saying the same things, like that she has to regulate really, really carefully what streams her kid can watch. And it takes so much work on her part, right? You got to watch a stream for a while, get to know the personality of the streamer, and do you trust what they're about to say? But the question of whether people are working with Twitch, so we have at least one person who was part of our informatics department here at UCI, Kat Lowe, who then has also been working with Twitch directly. I don't think Kat is here with us, but so there are people who are trying to interface around issues like how community guidelines can address like the language that you're talking about. But that's one of the things that I think we need to do better with those community guidelines is being more explicit. And that's true for esports spaces too, like in-person esports spaces. When we say just don't use bad language, what does that mean, right? But if we get more specific and we say, this word is not acceptable, this word is not acceptable, this word constitutes hate speech, then we've got a little bit more recourse, right? Because trying to educate those players is hard. But at least, you know, showing them that's not okay, I think that would be better. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So I've spoken with a lot of professors who note that, especially in the last 8 or so years, the amount of emotional labor that they're having to perform with their students has increased dramatically. So my question is, if esports on college campuses is oftentimes an initiative that's partly spearheaded or shared by professor labor, who do you think, maybe in an ideal world, is the proper person who can be there for students when they face discrimination to kind of take on that burden?
Yeah, it's a hard question because it's, to paraphrase the question, it's like you're creating these initiatives. There is emotional labor involved, right, for all the reasons that we talked about and more. But if it's spearheaded by faculty who are busy in so many other ways, who does that fall to? I think maybe that's something for us all to like think about together going forward, because I imagine some of the challenges are just resources, right? And I wish that I could say, hire someone who works, is paid and works part-time with the team, with the club, who's got some training in these issues, how to support diverse people, who can come in and take on some of that labor, right? And I think that would be ideal, if there's somebody who's being compensated, who's got training, who can do some of that. But I also know that you're resource tight, right? And that not everybody has access to that, and has access to those kind of folks. So maybe let's keep thinking about it together. Yeah, thanks. So I think we probably, seems about right timing-wise. Okay, great. So thanks again. Thanks for your questions. It was great to speak with you.